Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, 5 Ways to Build a Resilient Supply Chain. My name is Nick Reikus, Marketing Coordinator at the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals. I am seeing that we have attendees still joining the webinar, so while we wait a few moments to allow them in, I would like, on behalf of the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, to sincerely thank our members and subscribers for their continued support, which makes it possible for us to deliver this type of cutting-edge content. For anyone interested in CSCMP membership or subscription information, additional details can be found on the cscmp.org website, along with a listing of upcoming webinars and events. Attendees on this webinar are muted for a better webinar experience, but we definitely would love for you to submit your questions throughout the broadcast using the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. Also, please note that the rebroadcasting or retransmitting of this webinar is strictly prohibited without the proper authorization from CSCMP. With that out of the way, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's event, Gretchen Eischen, Chief Marketing Officer for Icertis. Take it away, Gretchen.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for this discussion on building a resilient supply chain. Our goal today is to make this a very practical and guided conversation, helping you and your organizations to have the right frameworks for building a resilient supply chain. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by a number of outstanding colleagues across the technology and consulting space, as well as, of course, having some CSCMP core participation today as well. Let me just take a moment and introduce myself, and then I'll ask each of my co-panelists to each take a moment to introduce themselves and their roles as well. As I mentioned, my name is Gretchen Eischen. I am the Chief Marketing Officer for Icertis. We are on a mission to transform the foundation of commerce and acting as the global leader today in contract intelligence. I'm so excited to be joined by this esteemed panel. Kristen, may I ask for you to just give a brief introduction?
Sure. Good morning. My name is Kristen Hanel. I'm a Sustainable Procurement Solution Advisor within SAP.
Fantastic. Vijay, unfortunately, is not able to join us on camera today, but Vijay, so glad to have you with us nonetheless. May I ask for you to just take a quick moment and introduce yourself as well?
Thanks, Gretchen. My name is Vijay Muttur. I'm based out of Bangalore. I work for TCS, and I head the Enterprise Transformation Group for the high-tech vertical. Back to you.
Thank you, Vijay. Phil? Phil, I'm sorry, I think you're on mute. We knew it was going to happen at some point.
Yep. Sorry about that. Good thing I practiced to do that again. Hi, everybody. I'm Phil Berry. I'm the Senior Director for the Retail Consumer Goods vertical here at Icertis. Basically, my role is I'm the liaison across the organization to help align and support strategic objectives for the retail and consumer goods area. Before joining Icertis, I had spent over 25 years working in various roles such as category management, global sourcing, product development, and consulting.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Phil. And Mark, thank you so much for joining us from CSCMP today. Please, could you give us a brief introduction of you and your role?
Very good. Thank you, Gretchen, and hello, everybody. I'm President and CEO of CSCMP. For those that know Rick Blasgan, Rick retired back in March of 2021. And rolling off the board, it's my pleasure to serve as the interim lead of the organization for some period of time. I have a 40-year history in supply chain and also have a consulting practice, so it's my pleasure to join today. And I've been invested in sustainability in multiple ways, having created the first official board chair for sustainable supply chain and creating the first ever direct relationship with MIT and the sustainable state of sustainability in the supply chain. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So it's my pleasure to represent the 9,000 plus members around the world of CSCMP and to support this webinar.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Mark, Phil, Vijay, and Kristen for joining us today. I know we have a tremendous amount of content that we want to have the opportunity to share today. So let's dig right in. I'd like to share with you just our agenda for today. Our intention is to really kick things off with a conversation around sustainability and supply chain trends. So we're going to spend a few minutes just understanding the scope of supply chain today. We'll talk a little bit about a few reports that our various organizations have prepared bringing various perspectives on supply chain from a buy side, a sell side, an industry perspective. We then are going to spend some time really going through some practical guidance and advice on how to build and create and grow a resilient and sustainable supply chain. So we'll talk as a panel about setting goals, the process for selecting suppliers, how to really assess risk within your supply chain and continue to maintain a strong understanding of the risk mitigation strategies for your organization. And then also really talk about how we will drive sustainability compliance, leveraging technology and data. We'll also talk about the importance of setting strong KPIs as we think about the ability to really track and measure a sustainable supply chain over time. We'll share with you a brief customer story and then wrap up. So a great amount of content for us to dig into. Let's start out by just setting the stage really for what do we mean when we're talking about sustainability and why is it important for organizations to consider. And I'd start really here with just a review of the United Nations definition of sustainability. Really, you know, when we think about what sustainability means and why it's important for organizations, the United Nations has defined sustainability as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability for future generations to meet their own needs. So we have a responsibility today as stewards of our companies to ensure that we are creating a sustainable lifestyle, not only for ourselves and our own organizations, but across the value chain that our supply chains represent. In 2015, actually, the UN General Assembly looked across, core principles relating to human rights, labor equity, the environment, anti-corruption, and worked to create this grouping of 17 sustainable development goals that countries and companies across the globe are creating commitments towards. They include goals like reducing inequality, promoting responsible consumption, taking action on climate. And I think this really provides for us an excellent framework for organizations to begin to look at and think about, where you may want to make commitments, where you want to have an impact in terms of creating sustainability for the long term. So this Sustainable Development Goal framework is a great place to start as you are starting to think about the goals and how this aligns to your organization's value system. But ultimately, I think it's important for us to also consider, why should organizations do this? Why does this matter? And certainly far beyond the risks that are here relating to brand reputation or relating to, and having a negative impact on the environment, there's a tremendous amount of reasons that organizations are seeing that they want to make sure that they are creating commitments to driving sustainability. And in fact, SAP very recently did a consumer study to really look at why does this resonate, why does this matter at a consumer level. Kristen, perhaps you could just talk us through some of the findings of that survey.
Absolutely, thanks, Gretchen. As you mentioned, SAP Ariba did this survey earlier in the year. They surveyed 10,000 consumers across 5 countries and 5 industries. And they found some interesting findings when it comes to brand loyalty, willingness to pay a premium, and supply chain transparency. So if we start with brand loyalty, turns out that 65% of consumers would be more loyal to a brand that is sustainable, in other words, adhering to the UN SDGs that Gretchen mentioned. Meantime, 48% of consumers are willing to pay a premium for sustainable products. And that aligns really well with another study done by NYU earlier in the year. It showed that between 2015 and 2019, sustainable brands grew 7.1 times faster than their conventional counterparts, but even more so interesting, I think, consumers were willing to pay 39% of a price premium for sustainable brands. So not only are consumers willing to pay a price premium, it's a pretty significant price premium they're willing to pay for sustainability. When it comes to supply chain transparency, I think we have a little bit of an image problem here because over 50% of the consumers surveyed believe that supply chain practices have an ethics problem. Now, the good news here is that over half are willing to buy from organizations that are open and transparent about their operations. This survey, along with the NYU survey, our study that I mentioned earlier, show the importance of sustainability to consumers. And as we'll hear further as we go through today's presentation, consumers are just one stakeholder driving companies to be more sustainable.
Absolutely, and such an important part, though, of making sure that we're keeping our eye on business and business growth. I think, it's really interesting as we give consideration to, where we are in the state of the world today, and thinking about the global supply chain disruption that we experienced in 2020. The concept of supply chain disruption has hit the news like no other time in our history. This must have been a very exciting year to craft a sustainability report, Mark. And I'm wondering, actually, if we could go to the next slide, you could share with us some of your findings from the CSCMP State of Supply Chain Sustainability Report.
Well, thanks, Gretchen. I certainly will do that. And I'd like to connect with Kristen's comments on the previous slide. In fact, there's inseparable linkages to what we found in our study. It's very true. When you think about all of the roles and functions that are in supply chain, it's the majority of the global workforce, from planning, sourcing and procurement, logistics, manufacturing, customer service. And if you want to interconnect the balance of your business, let's face it, smarter companies already said that we're not a holistic business without being a holistic supply chain, right? Michael Dell started it well over 20 years ago. So the point is that we need to understand, back in 2019, we took a pause at CSCMP and said, what is the next generation of talent development, and where are the areas that we need to actually help our supply chain profession advance? It was clear at the board level and at the organizational level that sustainability and the aspects of sustainability, not just the environmental footprint, but the ethical and the economic footprints as well, and supply chain's contribution to that. And really, where are we as an industry? Where are we as a function, as a, if you will, a comprehensive, right, business model? So we found now in our second year study that 47% of companies feel pressure to increase sustainability in the supply chain, not just meet expectations, but to put more effort in this area. And it ties directly with one of the multiple talking points, actually, that Kristen just brought up. The supply chain serves the business, but it delivers to the consumer. And we have to remember that consumers care, and really investors care, about what we make, who we connect with to make what we make, and where we get the stuff from, right? So it's all interconnected. And I think our study clearly shows that across all industry verticals, and through the great really help and support of the research arm of MIT, it is an exhaustive study on the state of supply chain, and really across functions, and not only that, around the world. So it's a great representation. So the pressure clearly exists, and it ties right to the findings that Kristen brought out.
Absolutely. And I mentioned, of course, 2020 being the year of global supply chain disruption. I'm really curious, as we think about in this next slide, the rise of COVID-19, we would expect that it has delayed sustainability commitments, but it's sounding like from your findings, that's not truly the case for all industries. Can you share a little more?
Yes, our 2,600 plus respondents in the current, if you will, published State of Supply Chain Sustainability. And by the way, we're now starting the third one with our research, right? So 83% of executives did say clearly that COVID-19 either accelerated supply chain sustainability, or at the very least created awareness and brought urgency to this growing part of supply chain and its ownership for, if you will, supply chain sustainability or corporate social responsibility. And one of Kristen's comments clearly is unfolding in the supply chain. People care about the human aspect of this, not only diverse cultures and, if you will, diversity within the supply chain and the people and the talent that's within it, but more importantly is the sensitivity to human rights, human trafficking, and other areas that impact and frankly are owned by the supply chain to step up and take responsibility. Executives understand that these are often areas of vulnerabilities that the supply chain is not aggressively and with a high degree of intentional engagement recognizing this. Now, the one caveat to this is that it's clear that larger businesses have more intentional focus on this than small and medium enterprises. But I think small and medium enterprises that are building products to sell to large retail and large manufacturers are soon learning that they can't participate without a sustainability footprint and a platform to commit, because they're part of the ecosystem of these larger companies as suppliers. One last thing I'll say on this topic is that I think today's procurement and sourcing professional has a lot of pressure on them and the leadership of the particular function, rolling right up to, if you will, the CEO and the board of directors of companies or the leadership level. And by that I mean is that strategic relationships have been exposed. What we really thought were, protection and contingencies and also sustainable buys, we found out were greatly exposed through this human pandemic, and perhaps even more so triggered by the initial Section 301 tariffs by the Trump administration. So a lot of this got exposed. So I think the study is a great benchmark for any to test their supply chain. Appreciate the opportunity to share.
That's excellent, Mark. Thank you so much. And really interesting as well to hear some of the reflections that you're sharing about, specific industries like retail, as well as, the broad scope of this that I think you also noted in terms of the impact at all levels across an organization, tying in the consumer, but also board and execs. I'm curious, as we think about this concept and Vijay, as we move into the next slide here and thinking about the work that you did, right, kind of bringing in a different perspective and really honing in on the technology industry and the effects that COVID-19 had. You created a report on building resilient supply chains in high tech for a post-COVID-19 world, and really talked about this butterfly effect. Can you share with us a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, thanks. I hope you can hear me. See, if you look at the high-tech world, it was an extremely connected world. One ripple happening in one part of the world would be felt elsewhere immediately, and that was done to increase responsiveness, reduce costs, and so on. And we all know it by the name of lean. So it was the entire supply chain was lean, and probably nobody before the pandemic thought that it would become a problem to have a lean supply chain. And no wonder, we have all learned lessons through the pandemic. And that was the essence of this paper that we wrote, saying that going forward, we not only need lean supply chains. Lean is not out, but I think we also need resilience combined with it. And some people have coined the word leagile for it, lean plus agile. So we not only need lean supply chains, we need we also need resilient supply chains, and added to that, sustainability becomes extremely important going forward. That was the essence of the paper I wrote with my colleague.
Excellent, and thank you for that, Vijay. I read the paper this morning again, and actually really, I was very impressed with the conversation about agility and indeed how, rather than just concentrating on efficiency, agility is really going to be the key element for success in the future. When we do think about what that's going to look like in the future, and as we turn to this next slide, Phil, maybe you could talk us through a little bit about, what do we think this vision of a sustainable supply chain will look like?
Happy to. Thank you, Gretchen. Oh,
sorry, please go.
No, go ahead. Am I good to go?
No. Yeah, please. I'm sorry about that.
So what's really interesting is if you think about looking at this slide, before I'm going to jump into the group is going to jump into talking about the 5 actionable ways that we can build a sustainable supply chain. I just want to reiterate that implementing sustainability goals and practices into an organization is a process. It isn't something that happens overnight. I guess an example of that would be when I was first exposed to the sustainability challenges of the world, early 2000, 2001. And it was interesting because I worked for a large organization, and the majority of the organization it was brand new to them. So it's critical to make sure it's not just something that one area of the company is focusing on, because you need the whole team to support it. So in terms of, when you're examining your supply chain and determining where to start, it's really, think about maybe choosing more sustainable vendors for materials or input, or getting input, or examining how to dispose of your waste at the end of life. So that's something that, would again get your entire company aware of the situation if every day, they're focusing on how they're disposing of waste at the end of a life of a product. But also recommend that we recommend you really pick an area to focus on, and then work to implement that continuous improvements across the multiple areas until you have the commitments and best practices across every stage of the supply chain, because it's definitely something that is going to take a while. So it's critical to start in one area, and then as that area gets stronger with it, you progress and move into additional parts of the company. Also, and as Mark mentioned, I think it's important to point out that it's an area where you need to get other business functions involved. This is not something that everybody just automatically understands and prioritizes. So it can't just be a procurement and supply chain professionals only to meet the sustainability goals, because it really takes the entire organization. So just make sure you're collaborating with the functions like legal, to make sure your contracts have sustainability clauses in them, or human resources, to make sure the suppliers who are on board understand the tools and analytics they'll need to produce to show accountability to sustainability commitments. And I guess the final piece is just, remember, this is a process, so start with one area and then expand. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. I appreciate that. And I think that's a great segue actually into our conversation here about, the practical guidance on getting started. It is a process. It is complex. It does involve the need for strong stakeholder alignment, not only within an organization and up through the board, but across the value chain. So let's think together about how we can get started around this. And we think that, really the first thing to do in getting started is making sure that you have a strong understanding of the goals and commitments that you and your organization want to make. Vijay, I'd love to start with you here and just get some guidance from you on how you think, if you're in supply chain management today, how do you take the consumer desire that we started with for sustainability, and how do you start to create these policies and programs and align to their needs? Where do you get started?
Yeah, we work with a number of customers, and some of the best customers in who have embarked on their sustainability journeys had very strong executive commitment to sustainability. The top management set certain north stars, which were they took them public. They spoke about them. Statements like we will be carbon neutral by, let's say, 2030 or 2040. Those are the kind of high-level North Star goals that one should start off with, and then trickle them down. Go talk to your manufacturing guys, go talk to your logistics people, and figure out what kind of goals each of those entities could have for themselves, and all of them rolling into the North Star. So some of the best companies that we have worked with have invested billions. They have set up circularity centers. They have set up a whole lot of infrastructure to handle sustainability. And I think that's the best way that we have seen companies deal with sustainability. And as you know, it's ultimately connected to what customers demand from you. And I would say that's the best starting place, for companies to start on their sustainability journeys, embark on their journeys, and deal with it not in fits and starts, but deal with it, go the whole hog and complete the journey of sustainability and achieve the goals. I would say that's the best spot. That's the best way to start off on your sustainability journey, I would say.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Vijay. And I want to say, as we kind of go through this conversation and have this panel discussion as well, feel free, Kristen, Mark, Phil, Vijay, at any time to contribute here. I think your comments, Vijay, about really starting out with, what are the key KPIs, what are the clear goals that you're going to want to have, and making sure that you have a strong process in place and an aligned strategy for how you're going to get there. Making the roadmap is a great way to begin.
Absolutely. Yep.
As we think about, kind of the next step in this, it's also, I think, just really about making sure that, we've identified the right participants, not only from an internal perspective and gain that alignment with executives on those goals, but we need to bring our suppliers along for the ride, of course, and really make sure that we are selecting the right vendors. We're going through the onboarding process strongly and making sure that they have a strong understanding from the get-go of those sustainability commitments and how they can contribute. Last June, the Microsoft CEO, Satya Nadella, issued a now famous letter to employees on ESG, and he said, "We will use our balance sheet and engagement with suppliers and partners to extend the vision for societal change throughout our ecosystem," really pointing towards, again, the need to consider that no business is doing business alone here. Kristen, I'd love to understand a little bit more about how SAP is approaching this. How are you helping customers to choose suppliers that align with their sustainability goals?
Absolutely. This is such an important part of the process. We heard Phil say you have to look at it from area by area. You heard Vijay talk about the North Star. However a company gets to their sustainability goals, they're gonna be looking at different goals depending on their stakeholders and what they're demanding. That could be regulators, that could be employees, it could be consumers. There's just a lot of different pressures on companies, and they'll choose different goals from one another. The important thing to note is no matter what that goal is, they need to make sure that their suppliers are in alignment with those North Star goals, as Vijay called them, because your company can't go achieve those all by itself. It takes the entire supply chain to work toward the goals that you've set. Of course, finding a supplier, it's been a challenge, right, since the beginning, and finding a supplier that meets the sustainability criteria that you've put out can be even harder. And this is where technology can really help. For example, the SAP Business Network is one of the largest supplier networks in the world, and you can discover potential suppliers based on the type of credentials you're looking for example, in addition to the other things you're used to searching for, like commodity code and region and so on. Once you've determined some potential suppliers, then it's important to use the technology of your sourcing tool to ask detailed sustainability questions, whether that be about certifications, science-based targets, or how they manage their own supply chain. This could be as simple as a prerequisite question before the potential supplier can even get access to your RFP, for example. The important thing is to realize that your old way of doing things, choosing suppliers only on price, that's just not going to get the sustainable results that you're looking for. So you'll need to ask and start weighting sustainability questions to find the right sustainable suppliers that you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Asking those questions, making sure that it's embedded into your sourcing process up front, ensuring as well that the commitments that you're making are reflected and communicated well to the suppliers that you are identifying and bringing into your process is so critical, as is, of course, making sure that the commitments that they also have, that they will be able to deliver the commitments that you as an organization are also delivering as part of your value chain. I think when that does present risk, certainly, because it's an external organization outside of your control. Mark, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how your view on how to really manage those sustainability risks. How can you identify them, assess those risks over time, and really create processes that allow you to manage that risk on an ongoing manner?
Yeah, absolutely, Gretchen. And some of this has been touched on, but let me take it to a level of detail that I think can help our participants today. So contracts were mentioned earlier, but you set the tone as a company when you're face to face with your current and prospective suppliers when you deliver a supplier code of conduct as a part of the arrangement. And that arrangement is, this is how we will agree to operate in principle and factually together. And that represents not only the business criteria, the financial aspects of the relationship, but it does and should lean heavily on the sustainability, or the, if you will, the corporate social responsibility aspects of how we will go to market. Because let's face it, nobody wants to wake up on Monday morning finding that you're being accused of packaging your products with wood pulp in your cardboard that came from the Amazon forest, and you had no idea your supplier was doing that. So these linkages can be found, and there are a lot of interest outside. Remember the survey, there's a lot of pressure on companies to perform, and there are people and associations and measuring tools out there that we really don't have any control over as practitioners in the supply chain, because they're monitoring us, right? So I think that really sets the stage. First and foremost is, how are we going to agree to go to market together? From everything from corporate social responsibility to ethical behaviors, because that came out in Kristen's opening remarks when we were talking about the 17 SDGs and the surveys that ensued from that. The consumers think, at least half of the consumers thought there's a potential, or there is, corruption in the supply chain. Well, we need to pay attention to that. Setting the groundwork, also setting the clear, if you will, supplier scorecard around performance. And suppliers don't like to always tell you, well, we stumbled and we got an issue, right? Nobody wants to fess up. But it's a really bad day if we catch you, right, as a buyer of your services or products and you didn't report in. So accountability and transparency is critical. You have to set that up on the front end. Expectations as well, right? Second, I think is important to look at is adverse media. So you have to inspect what you expect. So your supplier networks, depending on how many you have and how many actual categories you're buying from, both direct and indirect, you've got suppliers all over the place. And just take today's current environment and the amount of shift that's occurred. When we have human health pandemics, it just doesn't cause us to look at how can we ensure the business can continue through either some form of redundancy or a plan of resiliency. But when we do that, we often go to places we've never been before, or we participated in those markets on a limited basis. Well, guess what happens? It's true. We sometimes end up vicariously falling a blind eye into some other challenges that we currently say we don't have. And they generally end up in the area of ethical performance, which gets into our whole sustainability and our corporate social responsibility aspects. So we have to pay attention to adverse media from our suppliers and the markets we go into. I think the third thing, and probably more comprehensively to kind of wrap it all up, is, you know, when we think about natural disasters, such as the human health pandemic, we think also that the impacts of geopolitical shift, such as the trade war between the US and China regarding Section 301 and 232 tariffs that also gave birth to other country conflicts around trade. Well, that causes the supply chain to respond. Nobody wants a 25% immediate cost of goods to hit their bottom line. We don't want that. So what do we do about it? Well, we react. And if we're not proactively set up to do that, so there are companies out there that help support the analysis of our current suppliers and prospective suppliers as we look to, in fact, ensure our supply chain can always deliver at some level to the level of business requirements and consumer satisfaction. So organizations and technologies such as rapid ratings. I was a personal consumer back in my days of corporate America of rapid ratings, and I can tell you, not that I'm advocating for them, but here's what they can do that Dun & Bradstreet perhaps can't. And they can do the predictive analytics on, if you will, publicly traded companies. They called the Hanjin shipping line bankruptcy almost to the month, 2 years before it happened. So there's tools out there as procurement and sourcing, as well as supply chain professionals we can use to assess risk in the supply chain and stay on top of, if you will, where the natural disasters and economic impacts can actually affect our business. It's one thing to get a commitment contractually. It's another thing to inspect what we expect and to be prepared. And a great free resource I'll throw out there is Transparency International. Since the supply chain has been, if you will, in the eye of the consumer, flagged for potential corruption, I'd have to believe we're doing a great job mitigating and preventing that, but things do happen. So Transparency International is a great place to benchmark the opinions of global executives around where and which countries are least corrupt and most corrupt. And it's an awareness to actually double down or triple down when you're making buys in those high-risk countries, because corruption often leads to bad practices in other areas, human rights. So I want to offer that, and I think our sustainability assessment also showed that in this year's report, some attributes to this. So thoughts to consider.
Yeah, that's excellent, Mark. You know, I want to pause actually because we got a question in from an audience member a little while ago, and I think this is a great place for us to address it. We had a question about, you know, when organizations are looking to put these processes in place, they're creating their goals, they're making their commitments, they know that there's an initiative that they need to drive to create a sustainable supply chain. But it's really hard to do that when you have the day-to-day demands of work that going on, right? To think that long-term and strategic, and to invest those costs that are necessary as well. You talked about the need of technology, right, to help to not only predict, to manage and assess today, but to predict the challenges of the future, and leveraging technology to drive, you know, clear transparency. I'm wondering if you can just comment on, you know, how do you balance that challenge of there is going to be cost involved in order to deliver this, you know, a strategy for the long term versus, you know, short-term profitability needs that you and your organization have pressures to deliver? How do you think about kind of creating that balance within an organization?
Well, and I agree with the financial pressures of performance, that never goes away, right? It's never good enough. And that's understandable because the pursuit of continual, if you will, the right economic balance between cost and revenue and the satisfaction of stockholders, our internal stakeholders, whilst creating value for the consumer, that doesn't go away. So one of the areas that not one of the areas, I just kind of start with a kind of a building block, and that is often when we lean out our supply chains, we create a more sustainable footprint from an environmental perspective. Now you might say that, well, I can't nearshore. That obviously would reduce my dependency on a long 5,000 mile supply chain from Shanghai to somewhere in the US, for example, right? And I could nearsource, I could reduce, you know, global emissions and those kinds of things through logistics. Well, maybe that all-in analysis doesn't just come from within sourcing. It's a supply chain move, and you build out your business case to demonstrate that if we can move closer to home, what does that do for us? What does it also do from a human rights perspective? What does it do also from a supplier diversity perspective and other things that really matter from a corporate social responsibility standpoint, the contribution that supply chain makes towards that? So the economics thing, the economics piece, I don't really believe that and many don't believe that as well, that, you know, you can visit with great people like Yossi Sheffi. Great comments that he's made in the past is you attract sustainability to the supply chain when you show the economic advantage and the improvement from an environmental and economic and ethical footprint. It has to go together. So start with the areas where you have an opportunity to take cost out, and you're often going to find that you're going to stand right on top of the same kind of things principally and tactically that actually improve your sustainability, your supply chain sustainability footprint. So think about it in those terms. Don't always grab for the things that you know automatically are going to add cost. So recycled plastics versus virgin plastics, you know, or something like that. And I'm not saying that recycled plastics cost more, but in some examples that you have, if you're just going to reach for a specific raw material because that's what you consume a lot of, and you do that only from a sourcing perspective, you stand the chance to lose because that's not representing the supply chain. That's trying to come up with a sustainable win for procurement. That doesn't work. You know, so solve a problem for today and you solve a problem for yourself, you solve a problem for today, solve it holistically, and we solve a problem for a lifetime. And you got to think about that. That's why we call it a supply chain. Everybody plays. So look for the financial factors that address also a sustainable advantage. And I think the world will become much more open, and your company, to start, will become more sensitive to the fact that this really has value. So I would think about that first. If you're a company that's really driven by consumer demand and you know, if you're in the coffee business, right, sustainable sourcing and ethical sourcing of coffee. You can't get away from the sustainability aspects of this. And does it cost more money? Well, maybe if you make an origin shift, but you're still looking for sustainable sourcing of the coffee bean. So you think about things more holistically. You can achieve sustainability objectives and goals while at the same time meeting financial advantage for your company and also sharing some of that financial advantage by holding costs down or reasonably cost containment for your consumer as well. Improves your value and improves your market share. So think about it more holistically, but start with the financial piece. You'll find it.
Can I add just one thing to that, Gretchen? Because I think there's a real shift also happening. I love all of Mark's comments about looking at it holistically. I think it's also important to see that the ROI on sustainability is changing. I mentioned the different stakeholders and we talked about consumers, but I mean, government regulations are a huge, huge stakeholder, right? And depending on where you're doing business in the world, that's going to change your ROI on sustainability substantially. So Germany just passed a supply chain act that's going to start up in 2023. That's going to affect not just German companies, but anybody that wants to do business in Germany. And you know, I hate to say that the threat of regulation should drive it, because I think there's more to it than that driving sustainability. But the fact that you could lose 1% of your revenue if you're not in compliance with regulations around the world is a really good reason to be sustainable. Yeah. In addition to the consumer, but just to round out those stakeholders, and somebody mentioned investors earlier, you know, companies are starting to get rated by investors on their sustainability goals and how they're achieving them. And people like you and me can invest in sustainability portfolios now. So that's another driver, as well as the employees themselves. I've talked to several companies just recently who've said, you know, for the first time since I've been here, my new hires, like in the interview process, I'm being asked about my sustainability goals. And so not only do new hires, not only are they looking for companies that match their values, but now once they're employees, you've seen some of the walkouts happening at high-tech companies that they're saying, we don't agree with the way that you're using this technology. So there's a lot of pressure on all different sides and a lot of different costs that may or may not always show up on the balance sheet to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Another great point towards looking at it holistically, right? The risks not only in the supply chain that you need to manage throughout the tiering, but also looking up towards your board, your investors, and the consumer all engaged are really important points. Thank you. I want to actually just shift gears into point number 4 here and talk a little bit about, you know, when we think about the need to really manage suppliers during the relationship. So we talked a lot about kind of bringing them into the fold as we identify new suppliers and get them onboarded, setting those commitments with them and documenting those commitments in contracts and you know, sharing that supplier code of conduct that Mark talked about. When we think about the ongoing management of the supply chain and how you can make continuous improvements and optimize the way that you're actually driving sustainability compliance, there's a lot to consider. Vijay, I'd love for you just to talk to us a little bit about what your clients are seeing and how you're guiding for you know, really driving supplier compliance against those commitments.
Yeah. So, today, supply chains are global. I'm stating the obvious here, and it's very, very difficult to figure out what they say and what they do. So there has to be some you know, a carrot and a stick strategy, I would say. The first thing that I think companies should do is put contracts that are meaningful, that are easy to understand, easy to follow. I think a lot of you know, emphasis should be on the contracts, especially when the whole world is going to use newer technologies. Blockchain is going to come in. There are a lot of, it has moved past the POC and proof of technology phase to a stage where blockchain would be used for supply chains, monitoring supply chains and stuff like that. In such situations, having simpler contracts which can be codified and used by smart contracts becomes very important. I think I would lay a lot of emphasis on that. Taking these contracts should not just be followed in letter, they should be followed in spirit. That needs good communication, working on supplier training programs, supplier days. A lot of good companies do that, and there is no way you can have unhappy suppliers these days, and the relations can never be adversarial. Therefore, I think relationship building is extremely useful and extremely important, and of course audits go a long way in these could be done digitally. Some of them could be done, will have to be done physically, because I have worked with large companies. They may be high tech in their nature, but many of the suppliers are in remote places, still suffering from lack of basic infrastructure. So we need physical controls on such suppliers, and I think that goes a long way. New things like supply chain telemetry, for example, I think that's again not used very often, but supply chain telemetry can help a lot in figuring out whether your suppliers are compliant, whether they are doing things right as per the contract and stuff like that. So I think it has to be a mix of putting certain contractual obligations on them from a supplier sustainability perspective, and also using technology and bring in that human touch and ensure that they are part of the entire ecosystem. And it's a very cliched term, but the relation has to be a win-win relation, and I think that's the way to go about managing suppliers and the sustainability angle to suppliers.
Yeah, very helpful. I think your point about, certainly technology exists for doing those assessments, creating those audits, sort of the active management and measure of the relationship over time. I think, your point though as well about, the human touch and making sure that you have strong agreement and alignment with your suppliers is such a critical one. And I think if we go to the next slide here, Phil, I'd invite you to share a little bit about how, kind of creating that correct level of alignment and commitment together, and doing that through documentation, the importance of doing that. Could you share with us a little bit about this example?
Yeah, and I think just continuing to add to the discussion that Kristen and Mark were just talking about, it's also, I think one of the keys to this whole process, and we've mentioned it earlier, is it needs to be an initiative across the organization. This is not something that can be done in a vacuum to be successful. Perfect example of an organization that was recently created in 2019. It's the Chancery Lane Project, which is a collaborative pro bono initiative that brings legal professionals together to collaborate and rewrite contracts to support communities and businesses in fighting climate change and achieve the net zero carbon emissions, because I think that's something that needs to become more standard in contract agreements. And right now, you need groups like this to really be able to help provide guidance for many organizations, so they are covered and know what to be asking and looking for when they're signing agreements. The Chancery Project, their core principles are 5 things. There's one, it's independent, so they're not connected to any professional body. They're politically neutral, so they're safe. It's a safe space to innovate. So if people have thoughts, the lawyers or others have ideas on ways to make clauses written better, they'll have that. And it's also free and easy to use, which is nice. And it's collaborative, because everybody that's part of this project is there to really improve the environment. I mean, for example, in less than 2 years, they've already had over 55,000 clauses downloaded across 73 countries.
That's great.
So that's pretty impressive for something that in 2019 was literally just a discussion, and how quickly it's been able to go from a group of lawyers talking about it to reality.
Yeah. A true testament to how to drive a standard, right? And actually, creating this as a contractual obligation for, in a commercial relationship. What a great point, Phil.
Right. And then I think, moving on to the next slide about KPIs, Kristen, this is definitely an area that is interesting, because I think this gets into the human nature too, and how to manage their people, people managing their businesses. So it'd be interesting to understand what you think of what KPIs or key performance indicators organizations should be tracking when it comes to sustainability with suppliers.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about KPIs. I just want to make one comment on what you just said about the collaboration. I've had some wonderful experiences working with companies within circular economy, which is a term better known, I think, in Europe than the US so far. But really, the economy of circular economy is the collaborative nature between business. And we didn't have a slide for this, but I would encourage people to just get together with others that are trying to figure this stuff out, because whether it's the Chancery Project or there's the National Plastics Pact, trying to figure out the recycled plastics thing, you are not alone. There are people trying to figure this out, and chances are they're trying to figure out the exact thing that you are trying to figure out. So right. Collaborating with other companies and your suppliers to say, we don't know how to do this, let's figure it out together, is one of the fastest ways to actually getting things done. So thank you for bringing up the Chancery Project, Phil. That's super important. On to the KPIs. We've been talking about sustainability goals, in the past, and just as those goals are unique to the organization, their KPIs, right, are going to be unique too, because of course those KPIs should align with those goals. In addition to the sustainability goals and KPIs being in alignment, it's also important, though, that the KPIs across various functions within your organization don't conflict, or at least conflict as little as possible. And this was a problem way before we were thinking about sustainability, right? The supply chain people are, measured on one thing, and then there's another part of the organization that is measured on something completely different that actually lessens the effectiveness of the supply chain goal. So really taking a broad look at it and understanding which departments have which KPIs and how can they align to help one another get there. Similarly, like we talked about earlier, your specific KPIs are going to be determined by your stakeholders. I mentioned government, investors, consumers, employees. It's important to understand that those stakeholders might have different KPIs in different regions as well. That Germany New Supply Chain Act, people in all over Europe are really taking a close look at that, because it is about how you are treating people in your supply chain. It has real dollars affected, but it's not just for German companies. Like I said, it's for people who are going to have products going into Germany as well. Unfortunately, there are companies, and I'm going to mention Lorax. I don't get a kickback on that, but Lorax is a great company that helps track those regulations around the world to make sure that you're taking into consideration what you should be, because it's hard. It's hard to keep track of all of the moving targets going around in the world when it comes to regulations. There are also tools available that can pull information directly from your ERP and other systems to help you measure and track those KPIs that are most important to you. And that's really important, because if you're not watching it, something's going to sneak by you, right? So it's important to have that information at your fingertips and to be looking at it constantly, not just so that you can deliver, but also so you can communicate your achievements. That might be to your stakeholders, that might be to your regulators, whoever that is. You also have a reporting responsibility to make sure that they understand where you've come so far and the work that you still have left to do. Vijay, I'm curious about your thoughts on KPIs as well.
Oh, well, Kristen, I think you have covered most of it, almost everything about it. I will go down to some of the basics and talk I think it's completely industry dependent. You know, some are heavy on emissions, consumption of natural resources. I think those companies, and then there is a conflict, right? I mean, you recently had the conference in Glasgow, and what we all know what happened there. But I think companies should look at emissions in a big way, set manageable targets out there. That's which I can flag off as very important. Natural resource utilization, I think, again, a very, very important area, depending on the nature of your company, to look at it. And waste recycling and the entire circular thing, that's again, something which can be measured. As I said, analytics goes a long way in helping companies achieve goals in a very, very granular way and measure them granularly. So I think these are the kind of things that the companies that we work with are looking at, and makes a lot of sense. Digital technologies go a long, long way in helping them achieve these metrics, measure them, you know, track based on the responsibilities that people in their companies have. So that's the way I would say companies are going about supply chain metrics related to sustainability.
That's helpful, Vijay. Thank you. And maybe it would help for us to also just share a quick customer example here. And you know, we got a question in the chat relating to, you know, how are organizations leveraging technology and tools to actually understand their metrics and where they are in relation to progressing towards their goals. Phil, can you share with us the Daimler story, a joint customer actually that Icertis shares with SAP?
Yes, happy to. So first off, just to give a little overview of Daimler in terms of their vision in sustainability. So their supply chain management's goal is to gradually establish transparency even in their dynamic supply chains to identify potential risk of raw materials. And they are definitely one of the more complex organizations sourcing all over the world. So I think it's important here. It goes back to that point of gradually establishing transparency versus expecting to do it in a day. You know, this is a permanent task for them, since transparency cannot be created just by clicking a button. It's something that has to be done over time. And so that's why the experts from the different special units, such as procurement and supplier quality, compliance and corporate responsibility, work very closely together to advance the topic, because again, it's about working together as a group and not being just one individual part of an organization. So what was the challenge for them? The challenge was to drive efficiencies and be able to improve transparency across their supply chain. So the solution that was basically, we integrated with SAP, or our contract intelligence platform along with SAP to unify their procurement processes and ensure visibility. And so what the benefit of that was, not only did they standardize their procurement operations across 50,000 suppliers, but they also gained access to information critical to supplier management. And examples of that information might be things such as just understanding, you know, if there's contract expiration dates, or there's clauses in these agreements that need to be renewed every 6 months, 12 months, especially when it comes to some of these environmental clauses that might require third-party audits or on-site inspections. That's stuff that, to be honest, it can be very challenging if you're not leveraging technology, because you're relying on individuals from their certain areas of the company to be managing on their own. And that's the full-time job in itself. So I'd say it's really important to be able to leverage that software to bring visibility to the challenges. And lastly, that, you know, that also gets into being able to easily report across the organization what the status is, and not have to spend hours, days, weeks sometimes to try and find the information across in your contracts, because when you get into those global contracts, there's a lot of complexity and a lot of different areas of risk that can be open. And it's one of those areas, real quick, is that if you are you don't realize that the end company is perceived to be responsible for the entire process. So if you're a large global company, you're at major risk, even if it's step one in the process that you might not be involved with at all, to know what's happening in terms of what your suppliers are doing. So on that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Gretchen, because I think we're at time.
Thank you so much, Phil. And Nick, and if I can ask you just to go back to the previous slide just quickly, I just want to do a quick recap, right? Because I think, you know, Phil, your last point around, you know, businesses have a core responsibility. It is an expectation at this point to drive sustainability, create those relationships, drive that sustainability through the supply chain to have an impact. I hope that by sharing these 5 quick tips with all of you in setting sustainable goals and commitments and making sure that they are embedded strongly in your documented commitments and contracts, selecting and onboarding vendors that align to your commitments, and sharing the code of conduct with them, you know, and so that you have that mutual understanding of your relationship is so critical. Identifying and assessing risks, leveraging technology so that you can create progress towards your priorities, managing suppliers over time and tracking those metrics. We hope that this will be a great roadmap for all of you as you are beginning or, you know, continuing your journeys on building that resilient and sustainable supply chain. And Nick, if you'll flip forward to slide 16 for me, just a quick note as well. I said earlier that no business does business alone. We've shared some examples here of how SAP and Icertis particularly have been able to work with customers both on the buy side in identifying and onboarding the right suppliers that will help with your sustainable commitments. Also on the sell side and thinking about, you know, how you can track your obligations that your organization is making to the customers that you are serving. Icertis as an AI-driven platform in the center of that can help to really ensure that organizations are driving their obligations and commitments through, tracking to ensure that the commitments that you're making and the language that you're using is in support of your overall sustainability goals and objectives. And an organization like TCS that can help customers to create that business process, implement these solutions, and really look holistically at how to really drive the right level of alignment across the value chain, as we talked about, from consumer to supplier to investor at the other end, and really bring in this holistic business process to make a difference. We really appreciate you all joining us today for this discussion. I'd note as well that, you know, there's a host of resources that we talked about in today's conversation. The incredible 2021 sustainability survey that CSCMP put out on the state of supply chain sustainability, just a terrific report. Such incredible data included. The butterfly effect report that we talked about as well that TCS has crafted is also an excellent one, looking at the high-tech space particularly. We do have the consumer study that Kristen Hanel spoke about early on from SAP Ariba. And we talked about, you know, Transparency International, the Chancery Project, LORACT, some other you know, key resources as well that we hope that you'll have the opportunity to take a look at as you're developing and creating, growing your own sustainability practices. I want to say thank you to our panelists today, Kristen, Mark, Vijay, Phil. Thank you so much for being with us today. And to our audience, again, thank you for joining us. And most importantly, to CSCMP for hosting these incredible conversations and creating a platform for organizations to come together to really address these challenges. We genuinely appreciate it and are so happy to have had the opportunity to share this with you today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Wow.